Do you remember the general strike?
Well, it didn't affect me because I went to work at Kings Norton. From Kings Heath, it wasn't really too far, and I went on my bicycle. So, of course, it didn't affect me, but the works were closed, and of course the office worked anyway, those who could get there. But I can remember how the students took over the buses, and my brother, who lived in Kings Heath, he was able to get to work on a tram car that the students were driving. So it didn't affect him much. A lot of the people walked, a lot found old bicycles, but it was a terrible time really for a lot of people, all the works being closed and everything.
1931 there was a big slump and it lasted for 3 or 4 years after that. Did that affect you at all?
No, it didn't affect me. I was still working at Wigan, and the work people there were laid off. One office boy was moved out, but it was the work people who mainly that the slump hit. They were very short of orders, and it meant that they didn't require half the work people. Now, of course, that meant that they didn't require all the chemists in the laboratory either. And Don, who I eventually married, he was one of those who was laid off. And they were worried because, of course, they'd been looking forward to staying there all their lives, really, and it was a firm where they employed grandfathers and sons and grandsons. One after the other would be there, and they all hoped that they would get their pension when the time came. So to be laid off was very sad for them. It seemed to be the end. But work, it was very difficult to get work. My husband's father had a small business of his own. He had a business in the jewellery quarter. He made pearl buttons and that kind of thing. There was no plastics in those days. It was either pearl and melamine. They had melamine. He used to make melamine buttons, but plastics hadn't really come in. And when Don applied for unemployment pay, they wanted to know what his father did. And when he said his father had got this small business in the jewellery quarter, they said, "Oh, your father's got a business, well, he'll have to keep you." So he said, "Well, I can't expect my father to keep me. I want a job of my own." Oh no, they wouldn't allow him to have any unemployment pay at all because his father had this business. So Don was desperate. His father gave him some money every week, but of course he had to rely on his father for all his keep and everything, and I think Don was only one of many, many fellows, you see, that were in the same state. And he went round and round Birmingham, knocking and going into factories. Nobody was advertising jobs at all. And he would go in and say, could he see the manager, and offer his services, and no, sorry, we don't want anybody, no. And he went to one place, and they were a chemical factory of some kind. I don't know what, but it was some kind of a chemical factory. And Don said, "If you take me on, I'll work for 10 shillings a week," which was 50 pence. And they still said no. And he told me afterwards, he said, "I pleaded with them to give me a job because I thought if you could once get in, then you stood a chance of getting a job somewhere else if you were already in a job." But they were very, very sad days for many, many men. I know the men who'd been laid off at the works, I mean, in any case, they only earned a shilling an hour, so they hadn't had much chance of saving any money. people there used to come occasionally to say how things were going, if there was any chance of coming back. And I can always remember when things began to improve a little bit, and they decided, Don had been off work for 2 years, they decided to send back for him because there was a lot of yellow mud all piled up in the works, and they decided to got arsenic and all sorts of things in it, and they decided to analyse it and see if they could make some byproducts from it, which they did. And Don was sent back to deal with that, really. He came back after 2 years. A lot of them were out nearly 4 years. But as regards the pension scheme, they were very, very good. They said that they would allow them those 2 years that they'd been laid off. And all these men that came back, it hadn't made any difference to their pension. You see, I mean, if they did, according to the number of years they did there, that decided the amount of the pension that they did. Now, my husband worked for 46.5 years for Wigan, which was a long, long time. But he counted, even the years that he'd had off in the slump, counted when it came to arranging his pension. But they were very sad years for a good many people. A lot of people didn't know where to turn because they were so hard up. People went without clothes, and you could see children without any shoes. But the Police Aided Society began giving shoes, boots they wear, to the very poor children. They'd come to the schools to see which the children wear who'd got no shoes really on their feet, and they'd send for them and they'd provide them with a new pair of boots. There was a lot of things going on like that. The voluntary services were really marvellous, but I can remember the Police Aided Society because I used to do, every year they had a flag day to raise the money, and I always went first thing in the morning and did all day collecting money for the Police Aided Association, because I knew that the money would be well spent on these poor children.